Eleanor Whitmore picked up the crumpled letter from the floor, the one the stagecoach driver had dropped at her feet with a smirk, and she held it against her chest with both hands, her knuckles white, her chin trembling. Not from shame, not this time, but from the quiet, terrifying decision she had already made before the wheels even stopped rolling. She was done apologizing for the space she took up in this world. She had come 3,000 miles to be seen, and God help anyone who tried to make her invisible again. If this story moves something inside you, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me, because what happens next in Red Creek, Montana will break your heart before it puts it back together again. Eleanor Whitmore was not a woman who cried in public. She had learned that lesson early the hard way in the parlors and dining rooms of Boston society, where tears were treated as entertainment for the people who caused them. She had sat through enough dinners where women whispered loud enough to be heard, where men looked past her as though she were furniture, where the message was delivered without a single word being spoken: "You do not belong here, and you never will." She had carried that message for 26 years. She was done carrying it. The idea of the advertisement came to her on a Tuesday morning in March, 6 days after her cousin Margaret had announced her engagement to a banker from Beacon Hill, and the entire Whitmore household had gathered to celebrate. Eleanor had stood at the edge of the sitting room with a cup of tea growing cold in her hands, listening to her aunt describe the wedding plans in lavish detail, and somewhere between the talk of silk ribbons and the imported flower arrangements, she had heard her uncle lean toward a business associate and say just quietly enough to pretend it was private: "At least one of the Whitmore girls turned out presentable." Eleanor set down her cup. She walked upstairs. She sat at her writing desk for a long time. Then she pulled open the bottom drawer where she kept the newspapers she had been collecting for weeks, folding back the pages to the classified advertisements in the back, the ones she had been reading and rereading without ever admitting to herself why. She spread one open on the desk, smoothed it flat with her palm, and read the same notice for perhaps the 30th time. "Rancher in Montana Territory seeks a woman of honest character and willing spirit. Hard work required. Loyalty valued above all else. Letters may be directed to W. Carter, Red Creek, Montana. No promises. No flowery language. No mention of beauty or social standing or the right family name. Just hard work and loyalty." Eleanor picked up her pen and wrote back before she could talk herself out of it. She did not tell her mother what she had done. She did not tell her aunt or Margaret or the household cook, who had always been kind to her. She waited 17 days for a reply, checking the post herself every morning before the rest of the household woke, and on the 18th day, the letter arrived thin and brief and written in a hand that was careful but not practiced. The handwriting of a man who had not had much cause to write letters in a long time. "Miss Whitmore, your letter was the most honest I have received. I reckon honesty is a good place to start. If you are still of a mind to come west, the stage runs from Cheyenne into Red Creek the first week of every month. I will be there to meet you. W. Carter." That was all. Eleanor read it 4 times. Then she began packing. The morning she left her mother stood in the hallway of the Whitmore house in a silk robe, her face arranged into an expression that was trying very hard to be concern and landing somewhere closer to relief. "Eleanor," she said. "Montana. It's so very far." "Yes, ma'am," Eleanor said. "That's why I chose it." Her mother did not try to stop her. That told Eleanor everything she needed to know about how wanted she had ever truly been in that house. She took the train west as far as Cheyenne, then transferred to the stagecoach line that pushed north through Wyoming and into Montana Territory. The journey took 11 days. She shared the coach at various points with a traveling salesman, a Methodist minister, a young couple relocating to a homestead, and an older woman who fell asleep on Eleanor's shoulder somewhere outside of Laramie and snored peacefully for 4 hours without ever waking to apologize. Eleanor didn't mind. There was something quietly wonderful about being of use to someone even in such a small way. She used the long hours to study what she could see through the coach window, watching the landscape change from the familiar green of the east into something enormous and austere and breathtaking. The mountains appeared somewhere past Cheyenne and didn't leave. The sky above them was a size she had never seen before, wide and serious and completely indifferent to whatever small human concerns were being transported beneath it. She found she liked that. A sky that big had no interest in her waistline. On the 11th day, the stagecoach rolled into Red Creek, Montana, and Eleanor's stomach tightened into a fist. She pressed her face to the dusty window and looked at the town. It was small, a main street, with a handful of wooden storefronts, a livery stable, a saloon with a faded sign, a church at the far end of the road. A few horses were tied to posts. Several men stood in clusters on the boardwalk, watching the stagecoach arrive. The way people in small places always watched new things arrive with an attention that had nowhere else to go. The coach lurched to a stop. The driver called out the stop. Eleanor gathered her handbag, steadied herself, and waited while the other passengers disembarked. Then she took the driver's offered hand and stepped down onto the wooden platform, straightening to her full height, adjusting her traveling coat and looking directly ahead, the way she had practiced in her mind for the better part of 11 days. The reaction was immediate. She heard it in the silence first. The particular kind of silence that falls when a crowd of people are all thinking the same thing, and none of them are troubled enough by their own cruelty to disguise it. Then came the sound that always followed that silence in Eleanor's experience, the low murmur, the half-swallowed laughter, the comments traded between strangers who felt united by having someone to look down on. "Lord Almighty," a man said from the boardwalk. "That's Carter's mail-order bride." A woman nearby made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was clearly not sympathy. "Poor man rode all the way into town for that." Eleanor did not look at them. She scanned the platform for the man she was supposed to meet, the man whose brief, honest letter she had read 18 times on the journey west, and she found him without any difficulty, because he was the only person not participating in the performance. He stood apart from the crowd at the edge of the platform, tall and lean, with a hat pulled low, and his arms crossed over his chest, and he was watching her with an expression she could not read. Not cruelty, not warmth either, something carefully blank. How was handsome in the way of men who didn't know it or didn't care. Weathered and angular, and clearly more comfortable outdoors than anywhere else. He was perhaps 35, maybe younger, though the set of his jaw and the stillness of his posture belonged to someone who had been through enough to age whatever years had been handed to him. He walked toward her. He stopped 2 feet away. "Mrs. Whitmore." His voice was low measured. No welcome in it, but no contempt either. "The wagon is ready." That was all. No handshake, no smile. He simply turned, lifted her 2 bags from the platform, as though they weighed nothing, and walked toward the wagon, hitched at the edge of the road. Eleanor stood motionless for exactly 3 seconds. Behind her, someone on the boardwalk was still laughing. She picked up her handbag, smoothed the front of her coat, and followed William Carter to the wagon. She did not give the crowd the dignity of a backward glance. The ride from Red Creek to the Carter Ranch took the better part of 2 hours, mostly in silence. The road climbed through open valley land before cutting west toward the foothills, and the country grew more dramatic, the farther they traveled from town, wider, wilder, the kind of land that looked like it had been here long before people arrived and would continue not caring much after they left. William drove without speaking. Eleanor sat beside him on the wagon bench and decided that if he wasn't going to talk, she wasn't going to fill the silence just to make him comfortable. After perhaps 40 minutes, he spoke. "You're not what I expected," he said. Eleanor looked at him. His eyes were on the road. His jaw was tight. "No," she said. "I imagine not." He said nothing else for a long time. Then, "Can you cook?" "Yes." "Can you work?" "Yes." "Have you ever been around livestock?" "No," she said. "But I've been around difficult men my entire life, so I reckon the adjustment won't be too severe." Something moved in his face. She wasn't certain it was a smile. It was gone too quickly. "Fair enough," he said. They did not speak again until the ranch came into view. The Carter Ranch announced itself first by the smell of it, horses and earth and wood smoke, and the specific honest scent of a working place, and then by its scale. It was not small. The main house was a long, low structure of rough-cut timber, solid and plain, with a covered porch that ran across the front. Beyond it were a barn, Several outbuildings, a series of paddocks where horses moved in the evening light, and further out, the open rangeland that stretched toward the foothills until Eleanor lost sight of where the land ended and the sky began. A handful of ranch hands were visible moving around the property, doing the last work of the day before dark fell. They stopped when the wagon came in. Every single one of them. Eleanor felt their eyes on her, the way she had felt eyes on her all her life. That particular quality of attention that has nothing to do with welcome and everything to do with assessment. She heard something pass between two of the younger men as William drove past, a few words she chose not to acknowledge. William said nothing to them. He stopped the wagon near the porch, climbed down, and set her bags on the steps. He pointed to the front door. "Your room is the second on the right," he said. "Supper's usually at 6. We start early here." He moved toward the barn. "Mr. Carter," Eleanor called. He stopped, turned. She held his gaze steadily. "I understand this arrangement is practical rather than romantic. I'm not expecting flowers or pretty words, but I would appreciate being treated with the same basic courtesy you'd extend to any person who works on this property." She paused. "Is that going to be a problem?" He studied her for a long moment. "No," he said. "Good," she said. She picked up her bags and carried them inside herself. The room was small and spare. A bed, a chest of drawers, a washstand, a single window that faced west toward the mountains. The curtains were thin and the floor was unpolished wood, and there was absolutely nothing in that room that suggested anyone had prepared it for another person's arrival. Eleanor set her bags on the bed. She stood in the middle of the room for a moment. She thought about her mother's face in the hallway that morning in Boston, the particular expression of a woman who was relieved to see a problem solving itself. She thought about her cousin Margaret, probably at that very moment planning a wedding with silk ribbons and imported flowers, in a house full of people who thought worth was something you were born with, rather than something you built. She looked around the small, unpretentious room. Then she unpacked her bags and went to find the kitchen. The kitchen was in the back of the house, large and functional, and in need of a great deal of organization. Eleanor found an apron hanging on a hook beside the door, tied it around herself, and spent the next hour learning where everything was. By the time the light outside shifted toward evening, she had a pot of beef stew on the stove and a pan of cornbread in the oven, and the whole house smelled entirely different than it had an hour before. The ranch hands came to supper in shifts, 3 or 4 at a time, sitting at the long wooden table in the kitchen, with their hats in their hands and their eyes anywhere but on her. A few of them were polite in the careful way of men who didn't know what to make of a situation and were defaulting to manners as a holding position. One of them, a young man with a red checked shirt and an honest face, told her the stew was the best he'd had in months. "Thank you," she said. "Pete Harmon," he offered, putting out his hand. She shook it. "Eleanor." He nodded. Something about him relaxed slightly. "Welcome to Red Creek, ma'am." William ate at the end of the table apart from the others. He worked through the entire bowl without comment, and when he finished, he set the spoon down and said, "That'll do," and carried his bowl to the basin and went back outside. Eleanor stared at the space where he had been sitting. "Don't take it personal," Pete said quietly from beside her. "He ain't been that way with everybody. Just with most people. Since—" He stopped himself. "Sorry, ma'am. Not my place." "Since what?" Eleanor asked. Pete hesitated. "Since he lost his wife, 3 years back, and before that his folks." He shook his head. "Man's been dealing with hard things a long time. Some people hard things make them kinder. Some people hard things make them quieter." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Which was he before?" she asked. "Before the hard things." Pete thought about it. "The other kind," he said finally. "The kind that made people feel better about things just by being in the room." He stood picking up his hat. "Night, ma'am." She washed the dishes alone. She went to bed, listening to the sound of Montana wind moving over a landscape so vast and dark and indifferent that it felt for the first time in her life like the world was finally the right size for all the feelings she'd been trying to fit into the small rooms of a Boston townhouse. The next 2 weeks were the hardest of Eleanor Whitmore's life, and she had not had an easy life. The work started before dawn and did not stop until after dark. Eleanor was not a woman unacquainted with effort. She had managed the Whitmore household accounts since she was 18, had cooked and organized and kept records, while the family's domestic staff gradually shrank. But nothing in Boston had prepared her for the sheer physical demand of ranch life. Her hands blistered in the first 3 days. Her back ached before the end of the first week. She cracked the handle of a feed bucket on the fourth morning and spent 20 minutes fixing it herself, rather than ask for help, because she had heard the way two of the hands were talking near the paddock, and she was not going to give them the satisfaction of needing to be rescued. She overheard the comments, of course. She was not deaf. A man named Clem. Big, confident. The kind of man who confused loudness with authority, had decided she was a source of reliable entertainment. She heard him one morning near the water trough, telling the younger hands that Carter had ordered himself a wife and gotten a cart horse instead. And they laughed in that low way that men laugh when they want to sound like they aren't laughing. Eleanor carried 2 full buckets to the horses without spilling a drop, and did not look in his direction once. She heard him again 4 days later telling someone that she'd never last the month, that women like that didn't have the constitution for real work, that Carter was going to send her back east before the snow came. Eleanor mucked 3 stalls that afternoon, alone, without being asked. She organized the pantry in the second week, building a system of labeled boxes and sorted shelves that cut the time she spent preparing meals nearly in half. She started keeping notes on which animals were eating well and which weren't, which she slipped under William's door in the evenings, with small observations she thought might be useful. He never acknowledged them. But the changes she noted always got addressed by the next morning. She began noticing the things about this place that the roughness tried to hide. The way the land was beautiful in a manner that had nothing to apologize for. The way the horses moved in the early morning like they owned the world and knew it. The way Pete Harmon whistled the same 3 bars of the same song every single morning while he saddled up, never finishing it, just those 3 bars over and over. She asked him about it one morning. "What's the rest of that song?" she said. He stopped, looking surprised, like he hadn't realized he was doing it. "What song?" "The one you whistle every morning. Same 3 bars. Never the end." He stared at her. Then he laughed, a real laugh, surprised and genuine. "I don't know the rest of it," he admitted. "Just those 3 bars. My daddy used to whistle it. That's all he ever knew either." "Maybe that's enough," Eleanor said. He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Something that had nothing to do with how she looked and everything to do with what she'd said. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Maybe it is." William appeared to have no awareness of any of this. I was around the property constantly. Eleanor frequently saw him moving between buildings, working alongside the hands riding out across the range in the early mornings, but he was around Eleanor specifically as little as possible. He ate meals without conversation, acknowledged her presence with short nods, and communicated any instructions through Pete, as though using an intermediary would maintain some careful professional distance. Eleanor found this mildly infuriating and ultimately sad. She watched him with the horses, though, when he didn't know she was watching. He was a different person with them. Patient in a way he never was with people. Quiet in a different way. A gentle quiet, rather than an armored one. She saw him spend an entire evening with a mare that was refusing to eat, just sitting with her, talking low, not trying to fix anything, just being present. She thought she understood something about him then that she filed away and didn't share with anyone. The incident with the fence happened on a Thursday. Eleanor had taken it upon herself to walk the near paddock fence line after one of the younger hands mentioned, without directing it to her, that there was a section that needed looking at. She found it a 12-foot stretch where 3 rails had rotted through and were held together mostly by habit and dry weather. And she was examining it, working out in her mind whether she could repair it with what she'd seen in the barn, when Clem appeared around the corner of the fence and stopped. He looked at her. He looked at the fence. He looked back at her with an expression that he'd apparently decided was amusement. "Ma'am," he said in the particular tone of a man who uses a polite word to deliver an impolite message. "You lost." "No," Eleanor said. "This ain't the kitchen." "I can see that," she said. I have eyes. Something hardened in his face. Look, he said, dropping the pretense. I don't know what kind of arrangement you worked out with Carter, but out here work is work. Real work. The kind that requires. He looked at her body in the deliberate, contemptuous way that certain men use to communicate that they've categorized a person as less than a certain capability. Eleanor held his gaze without blinking. What's your name? He blinked. Hadn't expected the question. Clem. Clem, she said. I've been watching you for 2 weeks. You're a man who's better at telling other people what they can't do than actually doing things yourself. She turned back to the fence, running her hand along a rotted rail. 3 rails. I'll need to pull them and replace them. Tell me where Carter keeps the spare timber, and I'll get this done before supper. Silence. Or, she said, stand there and watch. Your choice. Clem's face went through a complicated series of expressions. Then he turned and walked away, without saying where the timber was. She found it herself. She replaced all 3 rails before dark. She was sitting on the porch later that evening, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. Every muscle in her body, noting its objections in considerable detail, when she became aware that someone had come to stand in the doorway behind her. The fence on the north paddock, William said. Yes, she said. Pete tells me you did that yourself. Pete is correct. There was a pause. You could have asked someone. I could have, she said. But I didn't need to. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you're going to ruin your hands doing work that isn't yours to do. Eleanor looked down at her palms, which were in fact doing poorly. The blisters from the first week now joined by newer and more serious damage. Mr. Carter, she said, I'm a woman who has spent her entire life being told what I'm not capable of. I don't intend to spend whatever time I have here collecting more of the same. She looked up at the mountain's dark shapes against the darkening sky. If that means sore hands, then my hands will be sore. She heard him shift his weight in the doorway. Then his boots moved on the boards. She thought he was leaving. Instead, he sat down in the other chair. He didn't look at her, and she didn't look at him. They both looked out at the dark land. After several minutes, he said, she was afraid of the dark. Eleanor waited. My wife, he said. Clara. She was afraid of the dark, so I used to leave a lamp burning in the window, all night even after she fell asleep. He stopped, seemed to be working out whether he was going to continue. After she was gone, I kept leaving it on. I don't know why. Habit, I suppose, or something else. Eleanor said nothing. I put it out 6 months ago, he said. The lamp. She heard what was underneath that sentence. 6 months ago, he had decided to stop waiting for someone to come home. I'm sorry, she said, and she meant it in the full, complete way of someone who understood what it was to be lonely in a house full of people. He nodded once, barely perceptibly. He stood up. Your room has an extra quilt in the chest, he said. The nights get cold fast this time of year. He went inside. Eleanor sat alone on the porch until the stars were fully out, and they were more than she had ever seen in one sky, brilliant and dense and immeasurably far away. And she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. It did not make everything simple. The town of Red Creek made sure of that. 3 days later, Eleanor rode into Red Creek with Pete Harmon to pick up supplies, and the experience confirmed everything the first day had promised. The women on the main street watched her progress past the storefronts with expressions ranging from polite distaste to outright contempt. A woman she learned was called Mrs. Aldridge, wife of the man who owned the largest general store, important in the specific limited way that people in small places can be important, stopped in the middle of the boardwalk, directly in front of Eleanor's path. Mrs. Carter, she said in a tone that put quotation marks around the word. We've all been so curious. Have you? Eleanor said. William Carter is a very particular man. We've all been wondering what kind of woman would suit him. Her eyes moved over Eleanor slowly. I see he made some unconventional choices in his advertisement. He asked for honesty and hard work, Eleanor said. He got both. Mrs. Aldridge tilted her head, the smile not reaching her eyes. Of course. Well, I'm sure you'll find Red Creek very welcoming. We're a community that values certain kinds of contribution. Ma'am, Eleanor said pleasantly. I've been in Red Creek approximately 6 minutes. In that time, 2 men have stared. One woman has laughed behind her hand, and you've found a way to insult me 3 times using purely gracious language. I spent 26 years in Boston learning how people like you operate. She smiled with equal pleasantness. I'm a quick study. Excuse me? She stepped around Mrs. Aldridge and walked into the hardware store. Pete caught up with her 30 seconds later, his face working very hard to stay neutral. You do that often, he managed. Only when necessary, Eleanor said. Where do they keep the nails? She heard later through Pete, who seemed to have developed a habit of keeping her informed, that Mrs. Aldridge had told 3 separate people that afternoon that Eleanor Whitmore was the most disagreeable woman she had ever encountered. Eleanor considered this on the whole a satisfactory outcome. The turning point with the hands came at the end of the 3rd week. A young ranch hand named Danny 17, maybe 18. Trying very hard to seem older, had been thrown from a horse on the far side of the north pasture and dragged himself back to the barn with a wrist that was clearly broken and a pride that was clearly worse. He sat in the corner of the barn, refusing to let anyone look at it, his face white, his jaw set in the specific stubborn expression of young men who have decided pain is something they're supposed to ignore. Eleanor was passing the barn when she heard the commotion. She walked in. She assessed the situation in roughly 4 seconds. Danny, she said. He looked up at her. He'd never spoken to her directly. Let me see it, she said. I'm fine, he said. You're not fine, she said. And I need you to trust me for the next 5 minutes, and then you can go back to being fine. She knelt down in front of him, which was not easy in a skirt on a barn floor, and held out her hand. I've seen a broken wrist before. My brother broke his when I was 12. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm just going to see how bad it is. He stared at her. The other hands were watching. Slowly he held out his arm. She examined it with careful, deliberate hands, and she was right. It was broken, a clean fracture, serious but not catastrophic. She told him what it was without softening it or dramatizing it, which she could see he appreciated. Then she sent Pete for the doctor, organized a sling from a piece of cloth she tore from her own petticoat, and sat with Danny until the white had gone from his face and he was breathing more steadily. Thank you, ma'am, he said finally, in a voice that was smaller than his usual voice. You're welcome, she said. She stood up, brushed the barn floor off her skirt, and became aware that the barn had gone very quiet. She looked up. 4 ranch hands were standing in a loose semicircle watching her. Not the way they'd been watching her for 3 weeks. A different way. Clem was there. He turned his hat over in his hands, looked at the ground and said, Ma'am, that was... He stopped. Tried again. That was good thinking. Eleanor held his gaze for a moment. It was just thinking, she said. The kind any person can do when they decide other people are worth thinking about. She walked out into the late afternoon. The hands didn't talk about her the same way after that. William was not in the barn that afternoon. But that evening, when Eleanor came back to the porch after the supper dishes were done, there was a small bunch of wildflowers on the railing beside her usual chair. No note. No explanation. She looked at them for a long time. She picked them up and carried them inside. She set them in a glass of water on her windowsill. Outside, the Montana sky went from orange to violet to a darkness full of stars, and in the barn she could hear William moving through his evening work steady and quiet, and she realized without quite meaning to something she had started to listen for. Something she had started to count on in the way you count on things before you know you're doing it. She stood at the window for a moment. She did not know yet what it meant. But she was beginning to suspect that the man who spoke in fences and suppers and wordless wildflowers was telling her something slowly, in the only language he still trusted. And Eleanor Whitmore, who had come 3,000 miles to be seen, was finally starting to listen. The wildflowers stayed on Eleanor's windowsill for 5 days before they finally gave out. She didn't throw them away when they wilted. She set them in the sun to dry, pressing the smallest one between the pages of the journal she'd brought from Boston, the one she'd been writing in since she was 16, the one that held every humiliation and quiet triumph of a life spent being underestimated. The dried flower went in between 2 pages she'd written in the week before she left Massachusetts. Pages that were angry in the way only a woman who has decided she's done being patient can be angry. She thought that was a fitting place for it. William didn't acknowledge the flowers. He didn't leave more. But something had shifted in the way he occupied the same space as her. A degree of stiffness had gone out of his posture when she walked into a room, and sometimes, just occasionally, she caught him watching her from across the yard with an expression that disappeared the moment he knew she'd seen it. She filed that away too. She was getting good at filing things about William Carter. The second month in the ranch began with a hard frost that came down from the mountains overnight and killed the last of the autumn warmth in a single evening. Eleanor woke to find ice on the inside of her window and her breath visible in the small bedroom. And she dressed in the dark by feel, pulling on every layer she owned, in a configuration that would have made the Boston society ladies cover their eyes, and went to start the kitchen stove before the hands came in for breakfast. She got there to find William already at the stove. He turned when she came in, registered her layered practical disaster of an outfit, and said nothing. He stepped aside so she could get to the stove. "I had it," he said. "So did I," she said. He stepped further aside. She got the fire going in under 2 minutes. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot he'd already made and set one on the counter beside her without comment. She picked it up. They stood in the kitchen for a moment, not talking, both holding coffee, the stove ticking as it heated up the dark outside the window, just beginning to separate from itself into the gray that preceded dawn. "The frost will set the ground," he said finally. "The fence work you were planning on the east line, it'll have to wait." "I know," she said. "I was going to move to the storage inventory today instead." He looked at her sideways. "The storage inventory. The pantry has been organized for a month. The dry storage in the barn still looks like someone lost an argument with it." She sipped the coffee. "I've been waiting for a day I couldn't be outside." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Peterson's been managing that storage for 15 years. "Then Peterson has 15 years of creative chaos to account for," she said. "I found 4 sacks of grain behind a wall of broken equipment last week. They were good grain, just completely inaccessible." William turned his cup in his hands. "Peterson's not going to like that." "Peterson doesn't have to like it," Eleanor said. "He just has to be able to find things." There was a beat of silence. Something crossed William's face that he didn't quite manage to put away in time. It wasn't exactly a smile. It was more like the memory of one. "All right," he said. He took his coffee and went out to start the day. Eleanor stood at the stove and felt something warm move through her that had nothing to do with the fire. The dry storage project took 3 days and created an ongoing war of cold silence with Peterson, who was 54 years old and had been managing supplies on the Carter Ranch for longer than some of the younger hands had been alive. He was not a cruel man, which was something. But he was a man who had organized a system he understood and had no interest in understanding a new one. Particularly when the new one was being introduced by a woman he had already decided on the basis of first impressions didn't belong. I didn't say that. He communicated it through a masterwork of small obstructions tools left in exactly the wrong places. Supplies moved back after Eleanor had moved them, comments delivered to the general air that were somehow always just loud enough to hear. Eleanor worked around him methodically. She was experienced at this. She'd been working around men like Peterson her entire life. On the 3rd day, she found him blocking the entrance to the storage room, arms crossed, jaw set. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "with respect, you're disrupting a system that works." "It doesn't work," Eleanor said pleasantly. "It exists. Those aren't the same thing. Been working fine for 15 years. "Then why are we consistently short on supplies by the 3rd week of every month?" she said. "Mr. Carter mentioned it to me last week. Said it had been a problem as long as he could remember." She met his gaze directly. "I'm not trying to replace your knowledge, Peterson. I'm trying to add to it. If you'll walk me through what you know, I'll walk you through what I'm doing, and between us, we might end up with something better than either of us could manage alone." He stared at her, his arms uncrossed slightly. He looked away, looked back. "The grain account goes on the west wall," he said gruffly. Always has. There's a reason. Tell me the reason, she said. He did. It was actually a good reason, something about moisture patterns in that particular building that she hadn't accounted for. She told him so directly. He looked startled, as though he'd prepared himself for an argument, and the absence of one had left him temporarily unbalanced. All right, he said after a moment. I'll show you the other wall issues. It wasn't friendship. Not yet. But it was something. By the end of the week, the storage room was better than it had ever been, and Peterson had started greeting her with a nod in the mornings, which from Peterson was roughly the equivalent of a standing ovation. Word of how she'd handled Danny's broken wrist had continued to travel around the ranch in the way that things travel in close quarters, slowly in pieces passed between people who added their own observation each time. Eleanor became aware of this, mostly through changes. She didn't have a specific explanation for the way conversations didn't stop when she walked into the barn anymore, the way questions started getting directed to her directly, instead of being addressed to the air near her, the way 3 of the hands had started eating their lunches in the kitchen, instead of outside, drawn by some combination of warmth and the particular quality of attention that Eleanor brought to every conversation she was part of. She never talked down to anyone. She never pretended she knew more than she did. She asked genuine questions and remembered the answers, and in a community of men who had often spent years being invisible to the people above them, in the ranch hierarchy, being genuinely noticed by someone was something they didn't quite know what to do with at first. Then they started talking. Really talking. Pete Harmon had a mother in Ohio. He hadn't written to in 2 years because he didn't know how to explain the choices he'd made. Eleanor sat with him at the kitchen table one evening and helped him write a letter. She didn't write it for him, she just asked questions and listened and said occasionally, "How about saying it like this?" and watched him arrive at words he didn't know he had. He sent the letter. He got a reply 3 weeks later. He brought it to her with the expression of a man holding something precious he didn't fully understand. He didn't say anything. She didn't push him. He just sat at the kitchen table and read it, and she put a cup of coffee beside him and went back to whatever she was doing, and that was enough. A hand named Ruiz, who had been with the ranch for 2 years, had a running complaint about a saddle that didn't fit right, but hadn't said anything because new equipment cost money, and he didn't feel he had the standing to ask. Eleanor noticed him favoring his side after a long day of riding and asked about it in the direct, non-dramatic way. She asked about most things, and the story came out, and she mentioned it to William that evening at supper, in the same tone she'd used to mention the weather. "Ruiz needs a new saddle," she said. "The one he's using is causing problems. He hasn't said anything because he didn't want to be a burden." William looked up from his bowl. "For how long?" he said. "He thinks about 8 months." Something moved through William's expression, something that looked a lot like guilt. He should have said something. He didn't feel like he could, Eleanor said simply. People often don't when they're not sure they'll be heard. William was quiet for a moment. The next morning, Ruiz found a different saddle with his name on it in the tack room. No conversation about it. No ceremony. Ruiz came to find Eleanor. "Did you?" he started. "I just mentioned it," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. William never mentioned the saddle either. But Eleanor noticed that after that he spent more time in the mornings, just moving through the property, stopping to talk to the hands. The way he hadn't before. Not orders, not instructions, just asking how things were going in the particular way, of someone who had remembered that asking was part of the job. She saw the shift and didn't say a word about it. She just watched a man slowly remembering how to be in the world again. She was at the water trough on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks into November, when Clem found her. He'd been different since Danny's wrist incident. Not warm exactly, but the aggressive edge had gone out of his behavior and replaced itself with something that was working toward neutrality. That was enough for Eleanor. She didn't need Clem to like her. She only needed him to stop making it difficult to do her work. But that afternoon he came to her without his usual armor, and she could tell immediately that something was wrong. "Ma'am," he said. "I need to—" He stopped. Tried again. "I want to apologize." She turned to look at him fully. He was looking at the ground. A big man, Clem, The kind of physical presence that usually made rooms rearrange themselves, and right now, he looked about 16 years old. "For what specifically?" she said. "What I said. The first week. What I said when you couldn't hear me." He looked up. I thought I couldn't hear. I could." She waited. "It wasn't right," he said. "I don't—" He shook his head. "My sister she's a big woman. She's got kids and a husband, and she works harder than any person I know, and all her life people have—" He stopped again. "I should know better. I did know better. I just didn't act better." Eleanor studied him for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. He was quiet. "Because you fixed that fence," he said finally. "And then you sat in the barn with Danny until the doctor came, and you helped Pete write his letter, and you—" He ran a hand over his jaw. "Because you've been treating this place like it matters. Like we matter. And I treated you like you didn't." Eleanor let that sit in the air between them for a moment. "Clem," she said, "you're not my first Clem. You won't be my last. I learned a long time ago not to spend more energy on being angry at people for how they start than celebrating whether they're willing to change direction." She held out her hand. "Fresh start." He shook it. His grip was firm, the kind that meant something. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Good," she said. "Now go fix the latch on the barn door. It's been wrong for a week, and one of these mornings a horse is going to figure it out." He almost smiled. He went to fix the latch. Eleanor turned back to the water trough and stood very still for a moment, with her hands wrapped around the cold wood of the edge, and she let herself feel it. The satisfaction of a thing genuinely changed, of a person choosing to do better in a way that cost them something, in a way that had nothing to do with her appearance and everything to do with who she had chosen to be. She breathed. Then she got back to work. The moment that changed the architecture of everything between her and William came on a Friday evening when the temperature had dropped so low that even the barn cats had migrated to the house and were distributed across the furniture in attitudes of complete seasonal complaint. Eleanor was in the kitchen mending a shirt that belonged to no one in particular. One of those ranch garments that got repaired and reused until its original owner was a matter of historical debate, when she heard William come in from outside, stamp the cold off his boots, and then not go to his room the way he usually did. He came to the kitchen doorway instead. "You're still up," he said. "Clearly," she said. He came in and sat down across the table from her, which he had never done before. He was carrying something, a letter she could see now, crumpled slightly at the edges. The way a letter gets when someone has been holding it for a while, trying to decide what to do with it. He put it on the table. "From my brother-in-law in Billings," he said. "Clara's brother, Thomas." Eleanor set down the shirt. William stopped. Looked at the letter. "He writes every year around this time. Around the anniversary. He's been asking me to come visit. To see where she's buried. He thinks it would—" He stopped again. "He thinks there are things that need to be said between us." "Are there?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Probably." He rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture she recognized as William Carter at the outer limits of his available emotional vocabulary. "Clara and I had a fight. Before the accident. A real one. The kind that—" He dropped his hands. "I said things I didn't mean. The kind of things you say when you're tired and frustrated and you think there's more time. The kind of things you never get the chance to take back." Eleanor said nothing. She waited. "She rode out the next morning on her own," he said. "She always rode out when she was upset. I knew that. I should have—" He shook his head. "The horse threw her. They said it was over fast. I don't know if that's true, or if they said it to be kind." The kitchen was very quiet. "Thomas was there when it happened," William said. "He got to her first. We've never talked about it. Not really. I come out here, I work, I keep moving, and as long as I'm moving, I don't have to—" He stopped. His voice had changed quality. Harder, more compressed, the way a voice gets when it's carrying more than it was built for. "I don't know how to stop." Eleanor looked at him across the table. This man who fixed things instead of saying things. Who left wildflowers without notes. who had gotten up that cold morning and made coffee without being asked, who had spent 3 years moving through the wreckage of his own life because stopping meant standing still long enough to feel all of it. William, she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without the formal distance of Mr. Carter, and she saw him register it. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," she said. "You haven't for a while if you'd let yourself notice." He looked at her. She held his gaze steadily without flinching the way you hold a gaze when you mean every word. "Write to Thomas," she said. "Tell him you're coming." "It's a 4-day ride to Billings," he said. "I know," she said. "The ranch can't." "The ranch will be fine," she said. "Pete can manage, so can I." She picked up the mend again because she understood instinctively that William needed somewhere to put his eyes that wasn't directly at her. "You've been working so hard to not need anyone that you forgot the other half of that equation. The people who need you to be all right." Silence. "Your wife loved you," Eleanor said quietly. "Whatever happened the morning before she loved you, that doesn't end because of one bad morning. It doesn't work that way." She heard him exhale. A long, slow exhale, the kind that carries something out with it. When she looked up, he was looking at the letter on the table. "How do you know that?" he said. "How do you know she's still after what I said?" "Because she wrote out to clear her head," Eleanor said. "Not to leave. There's a difference." She paused. "A woman who's done loving you leaves. A woman who still loves you needs 10 minutes of cold air to calm down." He was very still. Then he picked up the letter and folded it and put it in his pocket. "I'll write to Thomas tomorrow," he said. "Good," she said. He stood. He was about to go. He stopped. "Eleanor," he said, and the use of her name, her actual name without any formal title attached, did something quiet and significant to the air in the room. She looked up. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, plain and direct, and in William Carter's language worth considerably more than they might have sounded from someone else. "You're welcome," she said. He went down the hall. She sat in the kitchen with the mending in her hands and listened to the house settle around her in the cold Montana night, and she understood with the particular clarity that comes only in quiet moments, after something has already shifted, that the distance between them had changed its nature. It was no longer the distance of 2 strangers who didn't know each other. It was the distance of 2 people who did know each other standing on opposite sides of something, both aware that the step across it was available, neither quite ready to take it, but aware. Both aware. William wrote to Thomas the next morning. Eleanor saw the letter on the kitchen table addressed and sealed, waiting for the next post run to town. He didn't say anything about it. She didn't either. 3 days later, something happened in Red Creek that changed the tone of everything. Eleanor had ridden into town with Clem, a remarkable enough development on its own, that Pete had looked at both of them twice to confirm it was actually happening to pick up a supply order that was too large for the smaller wagon. They were loading the wagon outside the general store when Mrs. Aldridge appeared on the boardwalk with 2 other women who had the particular expression of people who have been building up to a moment. "Mrs. Carter," Mrs. Aldridge said, "we were just talking about you." "I imagine you were," Eleanor said, lifting a crate. "Several of us have been concerned," Mrs. Aldridge said, in the tone of a woman who has wrapped cruelty in the language of concern for so long she may have forgotten their different things. "About William, really. He's been through so much, losing Clara the way he did. And now bringing in a woman none of us know anything about. A stranger." Her eyes moved over Eleanor with careful precision. "We worry about him." Eleanor set the crate in the wagon. "What a coincidence," she said pleasantly. "So do I." "What we mean to say," said one of the other women, "is that Clara was one of ours. We grew up with her. We knew her family. We know what William lost." "Then you know how much he's been hurting," Eleanor said. She turned and looked at them directly, all 3. "And if you know how much he's been hurting, then you also know he's been out there on that ranch for 3 years, carrying it alone, and not one of you." She let the weight of that settle. "Not one of you has done anything about it except worry among yourselves." Mrs. Aldridge's expression sharpened. "That's not our place," she said. "No," Eleanor said. You've made it very clear what your place is." She picked up another crate. Clara would be glad someone's making sure he eats a hot meal and sleeps in a warm house. Or she would if she was anything like a woman worth grieving, which I imagine she was. The silence on the boardwalk was total. Eleanor handed a crate to Clem, who was behind her and had gone very still in the careful way of a large man trying to take up as little space as possible while history was being made in his vicinity. "Good afternoon, ladies," Eleanor said. She climbed up onto the wagon. Mrs. Aldridge said something as they pulled away, directed at her companion, something with the word nerve in it. Clem drove for 2 full minutes without speaking. Then he said, "Ma'am." "Yes." "Nothing," he said. "Just ma'am." Eleanor looked out at the road ahead. "Drive, Clem," she said. He drove. The trouble arrived on the last Thursday of November in a way Eleanor had not anticipated and couldn't have prepared for. She had been at the Carter Ranch for exactly 43 days. She knew this because she'd been keeping count in her journal, not out of misery, but out of the particular discipline of a woman who had learned not to take days for granted. 43 days in which she had gone from an outsider to something that didn't have a clean name yet, but was closer to belonging than she'd been anywhere in 26 years. And then Thomas arrived. Not by letter. In person. He rode up to the ranch on a gray horse in the late afternoon. Unannounced, a man perhaps 40 years old who had Clara's dark eyes and none of her brother's reserve, and he dismounted in the yard and looked around with the particular expression of a man who has been building up to something for a long time and has arrived at the moment before he has to actually do it. William came out of the barn. The two men looked at each other across the yard. It was not a warm reunion. "Thomas," William said. "Will," Thomas said. Eleanor was on the porch. She started to go inside to give them privacy, but Thomas saw her, and something changed in his face. Curiosity, she thought, and something cautious underneath it. "This is Eleanor," William said. His voice was careful. Not cold, but careful the way a voice gets when it's navigating terrain with things buried in it. Thomas removed his hat and held it against his chest. He had good manners. Clara's family, she thought. "Ma'am," he said. "Thomas Reeve." "Eleanor Carter," she said, and heard herself say it fully, completely, without the internal flinch she'd been half expecting. Thomas looked at William. "You wrote you were coming," William said. "The letter said 2 weeks." "I know," Thomas said. "I couldn't wait 2 weeks." He turned his hat over in his hands. "There are things I need to say. I've been needing to say them for 3 years, and I keep finding reasons not to." "Thomas, she wasn't angry at you," Thomas said. "When she wrote out that morning. I know you've been carrying that. She talked to me the night before. She wasn't angry. She was worried about you. Said you'd been working yourself into the ground and wouldn't let anyone help you." His voice cracked slightly. "She told me she was going to ride out and clear her head and come back and make you sit down and tell her what was really wrong." The yard was absolutely silent except for the wind. William had gone completely still. "She wasn't leaving," Thomas said. "She was coming back. She was always going to come back." What happened to William's face in that moment was not something Eleanor could watch. Not because it was ugly. It was the opposite. It was the expression of a man having something returned to him that he had believed was gone forever, and the sight of it was too private for witnesses. She went inside. She stood in the kitchen with both hands flat on the table and listened to the muffled sounds of 2 men in the yard, beginning to do the hard work of telling each other the truth. And she felt something press against the inside of her chest that was grief and relief and love, all folded together into something she didn't have a word for. She started making supper. She made enough for 3. Thomas stayed for 4 days. The first evening, the 3 of them sat at the kitchen table and talked until the lamp burned low, and Eleanor learned about Clara in the way you can only learn about someone from the people who loved them imperfectly, emotionally, with laughing, and then stopping with stories that ended abruptly and then started again from a different angle. She learned that Clara had been funny and stubborn, and had hated cold weather, and loved the ranch in a complicated way, the way you love things that demand more from you than you originally signed up for. She learned that Clara had wanted children. She learned that Clara had worried about William's silences. She learned that Clara had told Thomas in one of their last conversations that she thought William was afraid of his own life, afraid of how much he loved it, afraid of how badly it could hurt if he lost it. She was right, William said quietly. It was the third evening. Thomas had gone to bed. Eleanor and William were at the table alone with the lamp between them, and he'd said it quietly, almost to himself. "People who know us often are," Eleanor said. He looked at her across the lamp. "I'm afraid of it again," he said. "That's the problem." She held his gaze. "What are you afraid of?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. The lamp between them threw its small, steady light. "Losing it," he said. "Losing." He stopped, regrouped. "The last 2 months, the ranch has felt different. The mornings feel different. I wake up and there's something to wake up for." He looked down at his hands. "That scares me more than the fire season and the drought and the fence lines and all of it put together." Eleanor's heart was doing something complicated. "Because it's something you could lose," she said softly. "Yes," he said. She thought about 26 years of being told she was too much of some things and not enough of others. She thought about the letter she had answered alone at a writing desk in Boston at midnight, when the house was quiet, and she had finally admitted to herself that she was tired, not of struggling, but of struggling in a place that had never intended to let her win. "William," she said, "you left a lamp burning for 3 years." He looked up. "I think the person you've been waiting for," she said carefully, "might not be the one you lost. I think you might have been waiting for someone to make it worth leaving the lamp on again." The silence between them was different from every silence they'd shared before. It had weight. It had direction. He reached across the table. He didn't take her hand. He just rested his fingers beside hers on the wood, close enough to touch, not quite touching, which was exactly the right distance for a man who was learning to want something again after years of training himself not to. Eleanor looked at their hands side by side on the table. She turned hers over, their fingers crossed. Outside, the Montana wind moved through the dark and the cold, and inside the kitchen, the lamp burned steady and small, and William Carter held Eleanor Whitmore's hand across a kitchen table, and neither of them said anything else, because there wasn't anything left to say that the silence wasn't already saying better. Thomas left on a Sunday morning with a lighter face and a standing invitation to return in the spring. He shook William's hand for a long time before he mounted his horse, and he tipped his hat to Eleanor with an expression that told her she had been assessed and found worthy, which from a man who had loved his sister the way Thomas had loved Clara was not a small thing. "Take care of him," he said to Eleanor quietly, while William was seeing to the horse. "He doesn't like being taken care of," she said. "No," Thomas agreed. "He likes knowing someone wants to." He put his hat back on. Clara always said the best thing she ever did for him was refuse to stop trying. Eleanor watched him ride out. She stood in the yard until he was a small shape at the end of the road, and then a memory of a shape, and then gone entirely, and the ranch was quiet around her, and the morning was cold and clear and enormous. William came to stand beside her. "He'll be all right," she said. "Yeah," William said. "I think we both will." She looked at him. I was looking at the road where his brother-in-law had disappeared, but the corner of his mouth had moved in a way that she was becoming fluent in the particular micro-expression of a man whose face was learning slowly and reluctantly, and one muscle at a time, how to show what he felt. She looked back at the road too. They stood in the cold together for a few minutes, side by side, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him next to her. Then he said, "I've got fence work on the North Range." "I know," she said. "I might be out there past dark." "I'll keep supper warm," she said. He nodded. He walked toward the barn. Halfway there, he stopped without turning around. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes." He paused for a moment. "I'm glad you answered the letter," he said. She stood in the yard with the cold morning all around her and the enormity of Montana pressing in from every direction, and she let herself feel it, the fullness of it, the unlikely hard-won absolute rightness of being here, being known, being a person whose presence had genuinely changed a place and been changed by it. "So am I," she said. He walked on. She went to start the day. The morning after. Thomas left. Eleanor found William at the kitchen table before dawn with a map spread out in front of him and an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the closed, careful blankness of the early weeks, and not the slow opening warmth of the last month, but something tighter than both. Something that looked like a man calculating odds he didn't like. She poured 2 cups of coffee without asking and set one beside the map. He didn't look up. Hargrove came by last night after you'd gone to bed. She sat down across from him. Who's Hargrove? Runs the spread north of the valley, about 800 acres between his land and mine. He pressed 2 fingers to a point on the map. He says the creek that feeds the North Range is dropping, fast. Eleanor looked at the map. How fast? Fast enough that if we don't get significant snowmelt in the next 3 weeks, the upper pasture loses its water source before January. He sat back. We moved 200 head of cattle up there last month. Best grazing land we've got. Can you move them back down? Not without overgrazing the South Range, and if we overgraze the South Range, we lose the spring season. He rubbed the back of his neck. Either way, we're looking at losing animals. Question is, how many? Eleanor studied the map. What's this line here? He leaned forward. Old irrigation channel. Hasn't been used in 15 years. My father dug it, but the upper section collapsed in a rock slide the winter before he died, and nobody ever went back to repair it. If it were repaired, would it reach the north pasture? William was quiet for a moment. In theory. But the collapsed section is up in the ravine. Hard terrain. It would take... He stopped. Looked at her. Why? Because you're looking at this like you have 2 bad options, she said. I'm wondering if there's a third one. He looked at her steadily for a moment. Then he looked back at the map. The rock slide left a blockage about 40 feet long, he said slowly. If we cleared it and shored up the channel walls, it would take every man on the property working hard for at least a week in freezing conditions. Then we'd better start tomorrow, Eleanor said. Something moved through his expression. Not quite surprise anymore, because he'd stopped being surprised by her about 3 weeks ago, but something adjacent to it. Something that looked like a man who had stopped feeling alone in his own problems and was still occasionally startled by the sensation. It might not work, he said. It might, she said. He looked at the map for a long moment. All right, he said. He rolled the map up and took his coffee and went to find Pete and Eleanor sat at the kitchen table in the early dark and felt the particular weight of a problem that wasn't solved yet, but had a direction which was better than no direction and considerably better than 2 directions that both ended badly. The work in the ravine started the next morning and was brutal in the way that only outdoor physical labor in freezing conditions can be brutal. The kind of work that tests not just the body, but the specific quality of a person's will when their hands are numb and the progress is invisible, and quitting would be so much warmer. William worked alongside the hands from first light to last, which Eleanor noted was not lost on any of them, a man who didn't ask his people to do anything. He wouldn't do himself, earns a different quality of effort, and the effort in that ravine was extraordinary. Eleanor ran the supply line. She coordinated food and hot coffee up to the ravine 3 times a day, organized the equipment rotation, kept track of which men needed to come in and warm up before they pushed past usefulness into danger, and managed the ranch in the absence of most of its workforce, with Peterson's increasingly willing assistance. By the end of the second day, Peterson had stopped prefacing his sentences with hesitations and started just telling her things directly, which she recognized as his highest form of professional respect. It was on the 3rd day of the ravine work that Red Creek inserted itself into the situation. Eleanor was in the yard directing the loading of the midday supply run when she heard horses coming up the ranch road and looked up to see 3 riders approaching men she didn't recognize. Well-dressed for the territory, with the particular bearing of people who have arrived to deliver news they consider significant. The man in front dismounted. He was perhaps 50, with a gray mustache and the careful posture of a man who was accustomed to being the most important person in most rooms. He looked around the yard, took in the reduced workforce, and settled his gaze on Eleanor with an expression that had made a preliminary decision, and not a flattering one. "I'm looking for William Carter," he said. "He's not here at the moment," Eleanor said. I'm Eleanor Carter. Can I help you? The man looked at her, the way certain men look at women, when they've decided the conversation they need to have is not one a woman can participate in. I'll wait for Carter. He won't be back until dark, Eleanor said. And you've ridden a good way. Whatever you need to say, you can say it to me, and I'll make sure he has it accurately. The man's jaw tightened slightly. He glanced at his companions. My name is Gerald Marsh, he said. I represent a land consortium out of Helena. We've made an offer previously to Mr. Carter for the purchase of the Carter Ranch and the surrounding acreage. He declined at the time, given current conditions. He looked around the yard again with the specific gaze of a man cataloging vulnerabilities. Given the drought situation and the challenges facing cattle operations in this valley, we believe the offer deserves reconsideration. Eleanor looked at him steadily. What kind of offer? She said. He named a figure. She knew enough about the ranch's worth by now. She had organized the accounts in her second week quietly at the kitchen table in the evenings when William had gone to bed to know that the figure Marsh named was approximately 60% of what the land was actually worth. Maybe less if the irrigation work succeeded and the north pasture retained its value. That's a low offer, she said. Marsh's eyes sharpened. It's a fair offer given current. It's a low offer, she said again calmly. The Carter Ranch at full water capacity is worth considerably more than what you're describing. You know that. You're here because you think the drought has put Mr. Carter in a position where he might not. She tilted her head slightly. You thought wrong. A beat of silence. Mrs. Carter, Marsh began. The answer is no, Eleanor said. The ranch is not for sale. If that changes, you'll hear from Mr. Carter directly. I suggest you water your horses before you ride back. She turned and went back to the supply loading. Behind her, she heard Marsh say something to one of his companions, something low and dismissive, and she kept loading without turning around. Clem appeared at her elbow. You want me to? He started. No, she said. Let them go. They'll go. They went. Clem watched them down the road. He'll be back, he said. Probably, Eleanor said. Let William know when he comes in tonight. Accurately, please. All of it. Yes, ma'am. She handed him a crate. Now let's get this food up to the ravine before the coffee goes cold. She told William herself that evening before Clem could. She gave him the full account without editorializing names and figures, and the precise language Marsh had used, and watched his face go through several things in quick succession. Surprise anger. The particular cold fury of a man who has had his hardship treated as an opportunity by someone with money to spend. 60%, he said. Less maybe, she said. I was being generous with the estimate. He stood with his hands flat on the kitchen table, looking at nothing. He's been circling this land for 2 years. First drought, then Clara, he figured I'd break. He figured wrong, Eleanor said. William looked at her. Yeah, he said quietly. He did. There was something in the way he said it. Something that had to do with the fact that he was no longer someone who could be made to break through isolation, because he was no longer isolated. That made Eleanor look away for a moment down at the table because the feeling it produced in her was too large to look at directly. The ravine work is going well, she said. Pete says another 4 days, maybe 5. 5, William said. It'll be 5, but we'll get it. Yes, she said. We will. The irrigation channel opened on a Thursday, 8 days after they started. Eleanor heard the shout go up from the ravine, a wordless sound of pure collective relief from all the way back at the ranch house, and she was out the door and moving before she'd fully decided to move, walking fast up the path toward the sound, and she met the hands coming back down with the particular bright-eyed exhaustion of people who have done something hard and finished it. William was at the back of the group. He was muddy from boot to shoulder, his jacket torn at one elbow, his hat absent entirely, and he was smiling. Not the micro-expression she'd been learning to read. A real smile, the full-face kind, the kind Pete had described when he said, William used to be the kind of man who made people feel better about things just by being in the room. That man was in the room. Eleanor stopped walking. He walked up to her and stopped. Water's moving, he said. I heard, she said. He looked at her for a moment. The smile had settled into something quieter, but no less present. You were right, he said. About the third option. I usually am, she said. You're going to have to get used to that. He laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh. Not a polite sound, not a held-back thing, a real laugh, surprised and genuine and warm, and the sound of it did something to the inside of Eleanor's chest that she suspected was permanent. The celebration that evening was modest by most standards. Hot food and a jug of something that Pete produced from somewhere nobody asked about, but it had the quality of something earned, which made it feel larger than it was. The hands were loose and easy, in a way Eleanor hadn't seen before. The tension of the past 10 days dissipated, and there was a quality to the noise in the kitchen that was new. Not just men doing their jobs in the same place. Something more than that. William sat at the head of the table. At some point during the evening, he looked down the length of it and found Eleanor's eyes, and held them for a moment across all the noise and warmth and motion, and the look was not complicated. It was simple in the way that true things are simple when you finally stop fighting them. She looked back. That was all. It was enough. The trouble came the following week, and it came fast, and it came from a direction Eleanor had not anticipated, which was the only way real trouble ever arrives. She had ridden into Red Creek alone. William was out on the North Range checking the water levels, and she'd taken the smaller wagon for a supply run she'd been deferring, and she was loading goods at the general store when she heard her name. Her real name. Her Boston name. Eleanor Whitmore. She turned. The woman standing on the boardwalk was perhaps 30. Well-dressed in a way that was too carefully calibrated to be accidental, with the kind of posture that came from a specific kind of upbringing. She was looking at Eleanor with an expression. Eleanor recognized immediately, though she hadn't seen it in months, the particular expression of someone from her old world who had already organized Eleanor into a category and found her visit to Montana conceptually confusing. Victoria Hale, Eleanor said, because it was Victoria Hale née Aldridge, whose parents had 2 houses in Boston, and who had been at various points in Eleanor's social life, the sharpest instrument in a room full of sharp instruments. I heard you'd come west, Victoria said. I'm visiting my cousin Mrs. Aldridge. I had no idea you were... Her gaze moved over Eleanor's practical clothing, the wagon, the goods being loaded. I had no idea. Now you do, Eleanor said pleasantly. Your mother is... Victoria paused with the precision of a woman who knows exactly how to use a pause. She doesn't talk about you much, since you left. I imagine not, Eleanor said. There's talk, Victoria said, dropping her voice to the register of someone conveying something important. Back east. About why you left. About circumstances. Eleanor set down the crate she was holding and looked at Victoria directly. Victoria, she said. What are you trying to say? Victoria's chin came up slightly. Only that people are concerned. That a woman in your position, a woman with your particular challenges, making this kind of arrangement in this kind of place with a man, none of us know it raises questions. What kind of questions? Whether you're being taken advantage of, Victoria said, and it was said with the perfectly calibrated delivery of someone who had chosen a weapon that could also be described as concern. Whether someone saw a vulnerable woman and made use of that vulnerability. Eleanor was very still. She looked at Victoria Hale for a long moment, and she thought about all the years she had let women like this make her feel small. Not because they were right, but because they were relentless. And relentlessness can wear down even the most certain person if the certain person is standing alone. She was not standing alone anymore. Victoria, she said, I came to Montana because I was tired of a world that had decided what I was worth before I had the chance to prove it. The man I married is a good man. The life I'm building is a real one. She picked up the crate again. The only vulnerable thing in this conversation is the idea that your opinion of my choices has any bearing on them whatsoever. Victoria opened her mouth. I hope your visit to your cousin is pleasant, Eleanor said. Good afternoon. She climbed onto the wagon and drove. She was 2 miles out of Red Creek before the shaking in her hands stopped and she made herself breathe through it deliberately. the way she'd learned to breathe through things, not suppressing it, just letting it move through without letting it drive. By the time the ranch came into view, she was steady. But something had been disturbed, some layer of hard-won peace that Victoria Hale's 10 minutes had managed to locate and prod, and Eleanor sat with it honestly in the kitchen that evening, because she was not a woman who hid things from herself. She was still sitting with it when William came in. He took one look at her face and said, "What happened?" Not a question. He'd learned her face the way she'd learned his, and he'd learned to read the particular stillness that meant she was managing something. She told him. She told him all of it, Victoria Hale. The carefully worded implication, the precision of it, the specific efficiency of a woman who knew exactly where to press to produce pain. She told it plainly without dramatizing it and without minimizing it, because that was the only way she knew how to tell things. When she finished, William was quiet. "What she said," he started carefully, "about being taken advantage of." "I know it's not true," Eleanor said. "That's not what's bothering me." "Then what is?" She looked at her hands on the table. "I spent 26 years being defined by people who had no right to define me. I came out here specifically to escape that. And I thought I'd gotten far enough away." She paused. "But Boston follows a person. The way they look at you follows a person. I thought I'd outrun it, and today I found out it can still reach me." William was very still across the table. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You know what I saw when you stepped off that stagecoach?" She looked up. "A woman who was bracing herself," he said, "like she'd been hit enough times that she held herself ready for the next one before it came." He met her gaze. "I recognized it because I do the same thing." Eleanor said nothing. "It's not weakness," he said. "It's what happens when people who should have protected you chose to hurt you instead." He paused. "But Eleanor, what Victoria Hale thinks, what your mother thinks, what Mrs. Aldridge and the whole of Boston society thinks, none of it touches what I've watched you do here. None of it touches who you actually are." His jaw tightened slightly. "And I'll be damned if I'll let anyone make you question that, including yourself." The silence between them was the kind that holds the weight of too many real things to list. Eleanor felt something in her throat that she swallowed back because she was Eleanor Whitmore, and she did not cry in public. But William Carter's kitchen at 9 o'clock at night was as close to private as any place she had ever been, and the look on his face was not something she needed to protect herself from. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "I mean it." "I know you mean it," she said. "That's why I'm thanking you." Something moved in his face. He reached across the table, not carefully this time, not the tentative fingers, beside fingers of the lamplit evening after Thomas left, but directly his hand over hers, warm and certain. "You're not what I expected," he said, and she recognized the words from the wagon ride weeks ago, the same words delivered in a completely different register, carrying completely different weight. "I remember you saying that," she said. "I meant it differently then," he said. "I know," she said. His thumb moved across her knuckles. "Whatever Boston sends west," he said quietly, "it's going to find you standing on solid ground. I'll make sure of it." She turned her hand under his. "We'll make sure of it," she said. He held her hand across the table. Outside, the wind came down from the mountains, cold and indifferent and enormous, and inside the kitchen, the lamp burned, and neither of them moved for a long time. The wildfire started on a Tuesday. Nobody was completely sure afterward where it began. Somewhere north, up in the timber above Hargrove's land, probably a lightning strike from the dry storm that had moved through 2 nights before, without dropping any rain. The first sign was smoke on the horizon at mid-morning, a brown smear against the gray November sky, too low and too wide to be anything other than what it was. William saw it first. He came into the yard at a run from the north pasture, and Eleanor, who was on the porch, saw his face before he said a word, and felt the alarm travel through her nervous system. The way alarm does, immediate total no space between the stimulus and the response. "Fire," he said. "North of Hargroves, moving south with the wind." Everything that happened next happened fast. William was shouting orders before he'd fully crossed the yard, his voice carrying the particular quality of a man who knows exactly what needs to happen, and has no margin for anything other than executing it. The hands materialized from different parts of the property, with the speed of people who had been woken by something in his tone rather than the specific words. Pete had the horses moving toward the barn inside of 3 minutes. Clem was at the equipment shed. Ruiz was already checking the water barrels. Eleanor caught William's arm as he passed. "What do you need?" she said. "Get the wagon loaded with wet sacks and the water barrels. Send it with Ruiz to the Hargrove boundary line." He was already moving. "Get everyone who's not able-bodied on horses and moved south away from the smoke direction." "William, I'll be back before dark." "That's not a plan," she said. "That's a wish." He stopped. He turned and looked at her, and she saw it in his face, the thing she had seen in him from the beginning. The man who stepped forward when everyone else was still deciding whether to the man who had spent his life carrying other people's weight as though it were his own, and couldn't stop even when the weight was killing him. "The water channel we opened," she said. "The one in the ravine. If the fire reaches the North Valley before it can be contained, that channel is the only thing between the fire and the east pastures. If someone manages the water flow, diverts it at the North Junction, it could create a break." He stared at her. "You'd need someone at the junction to operate the diversion," she said. "It can't be you. You need to be at the fire line." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "Eleanor," he said. "I know where the junction is," she said. "I helped dig it." "It's going to get bad up there," he said. "I know." "Eleanor." "William." Her voice was steady, completely steady. "You rode into that valley alone when Clara's brother needed you. You went back to the ravine every day when the cold was making sensible men quit. You have spent your entire life doing the things that needed doing, regardless of what they cost you." She held his gaze without blinking. "So have I. Let me do this." He looked at her for a long moment. She saw what the decision cost him, saw it move through his face. The competing pulls of protection and respect, the understanding that stopping her would be a different kind of harm. "Pete goes with you," he said. "Agreed. You stay at the junction. If the fire crosses the North Ridge before we contain it, you leave the junction and you ride south. You don't wait. You understand me?" "Yes, Eleanor." His hands found her shoulders, both of them, and the grip was firm enough to communicate everything he wasn't saying. "You come back." "So do you," she said. He looked at her face for one more moment, memorizing it. She realized the way you memorize a face before you do something dangerous. And then he released her, and turned and mounted his horse in a single motion, and rode north. Eleanor was already moving. The next several hours were the longest of Eleanor Whitmore's life, and she had survived some long hours. She and Pete reached the junction in 40 minutes riding hard, and the smoke was already visible above the North Ridge. Not the distant smear she'd seen from the porch, but something present and active, the kind of smoke that moves and breathes and has intent. She could smell it. She could hear it distantly, the deep, low sound of fire in timber, nothing like anything she'd heard before. Pete tied the horses further back, and they moved to the junction on foot. The channel was running. The irrigation work had held the water moving steadily through the system they'd spent 8 brutal days building, and Eleanor located the diversion mechanism and tested it with hands that were absolutely steady, which surprised her and then stopped surprising her because there was simply no time to be anything other than steady. "How long do we hold?" Pete said. "Until we get word from William, or until we have to move," she said. "Whichever comes first." Pete looked north at the smoke. "That fire's moving fast." "I know," she said. They held the junction. Eleanor worked the water diversion manually when it needed adjusting twice in the first hour, and listened to the fire talk in its low register above the ridge, and did not think about William, because she could not afford to think about William while she was doing this, and he could not afford to have her thinking about him while he was doing what he was doing. She thought about the channel instead. She thought about every hand that had worked those 8 days in the cold. She thought about Pete's 3 bars of whistle, and Danny's broken wrist, and Clem's hat turning in his hands when he apologized, and she thought about Peterson finally saying things directly, and she thought about Thomas riding up the road with Clara's eyes and the truth that William had needed for 3 years, and she thought about all of it as evidence of something, as a record of what this place had become in the months since a stagecoach had rolled into Red Creek, and a woman nobody expected to matter had stepped down into the dust and decided she was done being small. An hour passed, an hour and a half. The smoke was moving in a direction that was not the south, which was either the wind shifting or William's work on the fire line being effective, and Eleanor didn't know which and couldn't know which until someone came to tell her. It was Clem who came. He came on horseback at a hard gallop and pulled up 20 feet from the junction, and his face was black with smoke, and his voice was hoarse when he shouted. Fire's turning wind shifted Carter's water break on the east line, held its turning north. He pulled his horse up short, breathing hard. He says to close the diversion and get back to the ranch. Eleanor felt the relief hit her like a physical thing, a wave of it moving through her chest, her hands, the backs of her knees. She closed the diversion. Her hands were shaking now. That was fine. Now they could shake. "Where is he?" she said. "Coming down the North Ridge," Clem said. He stopped. Eleanor looked at him. "He's coming," Clem said. "But he took a bad patch. The horse couldn't. He came off on the ridge. He's on foot." The relief that had just arrived evaporated instantly. "How far?" Eleanor said. 3 miles, maybe less. But the terrain is—" She was already untying her horse. "Eleanor," Pete said sharply, "you can't go up there alone. The smoke is still—" "I'm not going up there," she said, mounting. "I'm going to the bottom of the North Ridge access road. He has to come down somewhere, and that's where." She rode. The access road to the North Ridge was a rough track that wound down from the timber through a series of switchbacks, and Eleanor held her horse to a controlled pace on the lower section, where the smoke was still in the air, dense and acrid, and she scanned the tree line at the top of every switchback for movement. She found him on the 4th switchback. He was moving under his own power, which was the most important information. But he was moving slowly, and one of his arms was held against his side in a way that told her something was wrong with it. His jacket was burned through at the shoulder. His face was black from the smoke. He was looking at the ground when he came around the bend and almost walked into her horse. He looked up. She was already off the horse. "I told you I'd be here," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He looked at her for a moment. "You're supposed to be at the ranch." "Clem said you came off your horse," she said. She was already looking at the arm he was holding. "Let me see." "It's fine." "Let me see it." He let her look. It wasn't broken. She was fairly sure it wasn't broken. But he'd wrenched the shoulder badly, and there were burns on the back of his hand that needed attention as soon as possible. "Can you ride?" she said. "Yes." "Then get on," she said. "Pete's behind me somewhere." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that had too many things in it to name. And then he did something she had not seen William Carter do in the nearly 3 months she had known him. He let her help him. Not the small private moments of the kitchen and the lamp-lit evenings. Not the gradual softening of a man who was learning to trust. Something more complete than that, the deliberate, conscious choosing act of a man who put his injured arm through her offered support and let her take some of his weight on the rough ground, and did not say anything about it, and did not look away from her when she looked at him. They walked down the switchback together. Pete met them at the bottom with both horses, and his face did the thing it always did when he was feeling something large and pretending not to. It went very still, and his eyes got careful. "Boss," he said. "Pete," William said. "Fire's out on the east line. North Ridge is holding." William nodded once. They rode back to the ranch in the early dark. The 3 of them, and the smoke was still in the air, but thinner now, dissipating the particular quality of a crisis that has peaked and is moving away rather than toward. The hands were in the yard when they arrived. Most of them, the ones who'd been at the fire line coming in from the north, the ones who'd been at the ranch coming out to meet them. There was a sound when William rode in, not loud, not dramatic, just a sound that meant something, the collective exhale of people whose person had come home. Eleanor dismounted. She stood in the yard and watched William swing down carefully, protecting his shoulder. Watched Pete take the reins, watched Clem appear from somewhere and say something in a low voice that made William respond with a short nod. Then William looked across the yard at her. He crossed the distance without any hesitation. He stopped in front of her. His burned hand came up, and his fingers found the side of her face. Not her shoulder, not her arm, her face with the particular deliberateness of a man who has decided to stop speaking in half measures. "You stayed at the junction," he said. "Until Clem came," she said. "You came to the Ridge Road." "Yes." "I told you." "You told me to leave if the fire crossed the North Ridge," she said. "It didn't." She held his gaze. "So I didn't." He looked at her for a long-held moment. "I've been afraid of needing someone," he said low enough that only she could hear it. "For 3 years I've been afraid of it." "I know," she said. "I'm not afraid of it anymore," he said. She reached up and put her hand over his where it rested against her face. Around them, the yard was full of tired, smoke-stained men, doing the work of ending a very long day, and the horses were blowing steam in the cold air, and somewhere behind the house, Pete had started whistling his 3 bars of song, and the night was coming down over the Montana mountains, the way it always did, enormous and cold and full of stars that didn't care about anything as small and particular and miraculous as 2 people standing in a yard holding on. "Then stop being afraid," she said. He leaned his forehead down to hers. And Eleanor Whitmore, who had come 3,000 miles to discover whether someone could look past the woman she appeared to be and find the woman she actually was, stood in the smoke-tinged dark of a Montana evening and felt the answer settle into her bones like warmth, like something permanent, like home. The shoulder took 3 weeks to heal properly, which Eleanor knew because she was the one who changed the dressings every morning and every evening, and William was the one who submitted to this process with the particular grace of a man who had decided that accepting help was no longer something he needed to fight. That was new. She noticed it, the way she noticed all the changes in him, without comment, without making it larger than it was, just filing it alongside everything else she was learning about who William Carter was becoming, as the armor came off layer by layer. The man who had met her at the stagecoach with no smile, and 2 words had not disappeared. He was still in there, still economical, with language, still more comfortable with action than expression. Still the kind of man who would fix a fence before he'd say, "Thank you," for the thing that made him want to fix it. But there was another man living alongside that one now, one who knocked on her bedroom door in the evenings to ask if she needed anything before he turned in. One who had started leaving the kitchen lamp on again, not by accident, not out of habit. She had seen him light it deliberately on a Tuesday night when the house was already dark, and she had come downstairs for water and found it burning. One who had told Pete in Eleanor's hearing, but without appearing to notice, she could hear that the ranch accounts were the most organized they'd been in 15 years, and that Mrs. Carter had a better head for numbers than any man he'd hired. Pete had told her that William had said it again separately when she wasn't there to hear. She held that quietly for a long time. The burns on his hand healed faster than the shoulder, but left a scar along the back of 2 fingers, not disfiguring, just present the particular kind of mark that a body keeps to remember a serious thing. Eleanor noticed that he didn't try to hide it or minimize it, the way men who are uncomfortable with their own vulnerability sometimes try to minimize the evidence of it. He just had a scar. It was part of him now, the way all the hard things were, part of him worn on the outside where they could be seen. She thought that was progress. The 1st of December brought snow. Not the light, polite snow of the eastern cities. She'd grown up near the kind that fell prettily for an afternoon and turned to gray slush by morning. This was Montana snow, which arrived with intent and stayed with conviction, and Eleanor woke on the first morning of it to a world that had been entirely reorganized overnight into something white and enormous and deeply committed to its own silence. She loved it immediately. She stood on the porch in her coat and boots and breathed air so cold it felt like drinking something, and she looked out at the white-covered range and the dark line of the fence she had helped repair, and the barn where she could already hear Pete starting the morning work, and she thought, as she had thought more and more often in the past weeks, that she was not the same woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in October. Not because Montana had changed her, because it had found things in her that Boston had spent 26 years trying to convince her weren't there. "You're going to freeze standing out here," William said from the doorway behind her. "I'm fine," she said. "You've been out here 10 minutes. "I know." He came out anyway and stood beside her close enough that the warmth of him was perceptible in the cold air, and they looked at the snow together. "First winter's always the hardest," he said. "You say that like it's a warning." "It is." She looked at him sideways. "I fixed your fence, managed your accounts, organized your storage, ran your supply line during a wildfire, and operated your irrigation diversion in a smoke emergency." She looked back at the snow. "I think I can manage cold weather, William." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yeah," he said. "I reckon you can." But something in his voice was carrying more than the words, and she let it stay there, unexamined for a moment, just the two of them in the cold morning with the snow and the large silence of a world that was briefly too white and clean to hold anything ugly. It was Peterson who told her first. She was in the storage room the following afternoon, updating the inventory ledger when he came in with the particular expression he wore. When he was carrying information he thought she needed but wasn't sure how to hand over. "There's talk," he said. She looked up from the ledger. With Peterson, it was always better to let him arrive at it in his own time. "In town," he said. "About the ranch. About you and Carter." He shifted his weight. "Mrs. Aldridge has been saying things. About the arrangement. About—" He stopped. Tried again. "She's saying Carter's lost his mind, that you've got some kind of hold on him, that a man in his right mind wouldn't—" He stopped completely. Eleanor set down her pen. "Wouldn't what?" she said. "Wouldn't look at a woman like you the way he looks at you," Peterson said. He said it with the directness of a man who has decided the only way through an uncomfortable sentence is straight. "That's what she's saying, and some people are listening." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She thought about Mrs. Aldridge's particular brand of social surgery, the kind performed with polite language and concerned expressions that left real wounds. She thought about Victoria Hale's visit, about Boston, about 26 years of a world that had one story about her body and had told that story so loudly and so consistently that she had sometimes in her weakest moments almost believed it. "Peterson," she said. "Ma'am. Has Mr. Carter's work on this ranch gotten better or worse since October?" He didn't hesitate. "Better." "Have his accounts improved?" "Yes, ma'am." "Is the north pasture still operational because of the irrigation channel?" "Yes." "And the fire line held because of decisions made here on this property?" "It did." "Then anyone paying attention to what actually matters," Eleanor said, "is not listening to Mrs. Aldridge." Peterson stood for a moment. "You're right," he said. "I usually am," she said. "You're getting used to it." Something moved in his face that was close to a smile. From Peterson, that was everything. He went back to work. Eleanor picked up her pen. But her hand didn't move for a moment, because underneath the steadiness she performed for Peterson and for everyone else, there was a layer that was not entirely steady, a layer that knew Mrs. Aldridge's words had a target, and the target was not just Eleanor's reputation, but the specific fragile, extraordinary thing that was happening between her and William, and any weapon aimed at that deserved to be taken seriously. She was still thinking about it that evening, when William came in from the North Range with snow on his coat and the particular focused quiet of a man who had also been doing some thinking. She knew that quiet now. She knew almost all his quiets. "Hargrove came out to check the north line with me today," he said, sitting at the table. "He mentioned something." "Mrs. Aldridge," Eleanor said. He looked at her. "Peterson told me this afternoon," she said. William was quiet for a moment. His jaw had gone to that specific set that meant he was managing something careful. "What she's saying is—" "I know what she's saying," Eleanor said. "It's not." "I know it's not," she said. "William, look at me." He did. "I have been dealing with people like Mrs. Aldridge my entire life," she said. "I know what they're doing, and I know why they do it, and I know the difference between the damage they can actually cause and the damage they only sound like they can cause." She held his gaze. "What she's saying about you, that you've lost your judgment, does that change what you know to be true about yourself?" He was quiet. "Does it?" she pressed. "No," he said. "Then we don't give her the satisfaction of behaving as though it does," Eleanor said. "We get up tomorrow morning, and we do the work, and we live the life, And eventually, people who are paying attention will see what is actually true. And the people who aren't paying attention. She picked up her coffee cup. We're never going to be on our side regardless. William looked at her for a long time. You're something, he said finally. Yes, she said. I am. It took me a while to believe it, but I've got it fairly well established now. He almost smiled. Marsh came back, he said. She put down the cup. When, this afternoon, after Hargrove left, he came up to the North Line himself. William's voice had taken on a new quality, carefully level in the way that covered anger. He had new figures, lower than before. Lower, Eleanor said. He said the fire damage to the north timber reduced the land value. He said there were concerns about the water rights on the irrigation channel, whether the repairs constituted a new use claim that would need to be filed, which would take time, which would... He stopped. Which would give him leverage, Eleanor said. He was polite about it, William said. Very polite. The way a man is polite when he's got you in a corner and knows it. Eleanor thought about the irrigation channel. About 8 days of brutal work in freezing conditions. About Pete's hands bleeding on the rock face, and Clem hauling timber before sunrise, and William working alongside every single one of them without asking anyone to do anything he wasn't doing himself. He's wrong about the water rights, she said. William looked at her. Your father's original channel filing is in the county records, she said. I found it when I was going through the ranch documents in November. The repair doesn't constitute a new use claim because the use was never abandoned. There are records of maintenance attempts in 73 and 75 that establish continuity. She looked at him steadily. Marsh knows this, or he'd have led with it instead of mentioning it as a secondary concern. He's hoping you don't know it. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. You found this in November, William said. I told you the storage was worth organizing, she said. Documents as well as grain. He stared at her. You've been carrying that, he said, since November. I filed it in my memory in case it became relevant, she said. It became relevant. William sat back in his chair. He rubbed a hand over his face. Then he dropped the hand and looked at her with an expression that had too many things in it to name individually, but which taken together added up to something very close to awe. What do I do about Marsh, he said. Write to the county recorder in Helena and request a certified copy of the original filing, she said. Send it to Marsh directly with a note saying you've reviewed the relevant documentation and you're confident in the ranch's legal standing. She paused. Don't be rude, just be clear. Men like Marsh respect clarity because it tells them you know what you're doing. And if he keeps pushing, he won't, she said. Men like Marsh are opportunists, not fighters. They look for the open door. If the door is closed and locked, and you've shown you know where the key is, they go look for an easier door. William was quiet for a long moment. Eleanor, he said. Yes. He seemed to be working something out. She watched him arrive at whatever it was, watched him reach the edge of it, and then for the first time in all the months she'd known him, simply jump. I don't want to lose this, he said. You, whatever this is, I don't want to... He stopped, started again. I've been careful, trying to be careful, not to push things before they were ready, but I need you to know that I'm not, that I haven't been. He exhaled. Clara changed me. Losing her changed me. But you changed me again, and it's a different kind of change. It's the kind I actually want. Eleanor's heart was doing something complicated, and she let it. William, she said. I answered a letter from a stranger in a classified advertisement because I was desperate to be somewhere I mattered. I came west with one suitcase and no plan except to outrun the life I had. She looked at him directly. I didn't come here looking to fall in love. I came here looking to be useful. And somewhere between the fence repair and the dry storage, and the 3 o'clock mornings when you were sitting at this table with a map and a problem, and you turned it toward me without being asked. She stopped, steadied. I stopped being useful and started being necessary. And that's a different thing entirely. The lamp between them burned small and steady. Are you saying, he started. I'm saying I love this ranch, she said. I love these people. I love who I am when I'm here. She held his gaze. And I love you. In that order, because that's the honest order, and you've always deserved honesty from me. He didn't say it back immediately. She hadn't expected him to. William Carter didn't deal in immediate responses to large true things. He sat with them, turned them over, felt their full weight. He stood up. He came around the table. He held out his hand. She took it and stood. I was looking at her face the way he'd looked at it on the Ridge Road, memorizing it, except there was no emergency. This time, no smoke or crisis to account for the quality of his attention. He was simply looking at her because she was the person he was looking at. I love you, he said. Plain and direct, and in William Carter's voice, which meant it had been earned by months of becoming a man who could say it without running from it. She put her hand against his chest. She felt his heartbeat steady and real under her palm. I know, she said quietly. He put his forehead down to hers. They stood like that in the kitchen with the lamp and the cold outside and the snow on the world, and neither of them spoke because there wasn't anything the speaking would improve. The letter came from Boston 10 days later. Eleanor recognized her mother's handwriting on the envelope and felt the particular cold familiarity of dread. Not the sharp dread of new danger, but the specific dread of a thing you thought you'd left behind showing up at a door you thought you'd closed. She opened it at the kitchen table alone. Her mother's letter was 3 pages long and written in the careful performative style of a woman who had spent so long saying things beautifully that she'd lost track of whether what she was saying was true. It covered in order concern for Eleanor's well-being, concern for the family's reputation. Several pointed observations about the kind of man who would seek a wife through an advertisement. A reference to Eleanor's challenges, which was her mother's lifelong preferred term for Eleanor's body, and a conclusion that strongly implied Eleanor should consider returning to Boston before she made any permanent decisions. Eleanor read all 3 pages. Then she set the letter on the table and sat with it for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and wrote back. She wrote for 20 minutes. She wrote plainly and completely, the way she did everything now, without hedging, without the careful diplomatic vagueness she'd learned to use around her mother, without any of the small apologetic adjustments she'd spent years making to keep the peace, in a house where the peace was never actually about her. She wrote about the ranch. She wrote about the work and what it had made of her. She wrote about the hands Pete and Clem and Danny and Ruiz and Peterson, and what she'd learned from each of them. She wrote about the irrigation channel and the wildfire, and the water diversion, and the marsh negotiation, and she wrote about all of it in terms of what she had contributed and what she had built, because those were the true terms. And then at the end, she wrote about William. Not elaborately. Not with the language of romance novels, or the defensive language of someone trying to justify a choice. She wrote about a man who had said to her in the 2nd week that he was looking at the woman who stepped off the stagecoach when he should have been looking at the woman who stayed. She wrote that she had found in Montana a person who valued what she actually was and had never once asked her to apologize for the body that carried it. She wrote, I am happy, mother. Not in the way you hoped for me, which was a small, manageable happiness that didn't trouble anyone. In the way I always needed to be, which is completely. She sealed the letter. She sent it on the next post run. She did not wait for a reply to feel right about what she'd written. The reply came 3 weeks later and was shorter than the first letter, 2 pages instead of 3, which Eleanor took as a reduction in available ammunition rather than an improvement in understanding. Her mother acknowledged the letter. She did not retract the concerns she'd raised. But in the 2nd page, in a paragraph that took longer to arrive at its point than it needed to, she wrote, Your father always said you were more capable than anyone gave you credit for. I suppose I was not always the best judge of that. I hope you are well. That was all. It wasn't an apology. But from her mother, it was a thing that had cost something to write, and Eleanor read it twice, and then put it in the journal between the dried wildflower and the pages of old anger, which was where it belonged. She was at the kitchen stove the next morning when William came in and stood in the doorway with the particular expression he wore when he was about to say something he'd been thinking about for a while. I want to ask you something, he said. Go ahead, she said. There's a parcel of land on the east side of the main house, he said. My father always meant to build a second structure there. Never got to it." He paused. "I was thinking if you wanted we could build something in the spring. Not large. Enough for a kitchen that's separate from the main house, and a room where you could—" He stopped. "Pete mentioned you've been talking to some of the women in town. The ones Aldridge has been keeping at arm's length. He said you'd mentioned maybe a kitchen where women could come," Eleanor said. "Yeah. Where the ones who are struggling could get food and someone to talk to. If that's what you wanted." Eleanor turned fully from the stove and looked at him. This man. This careful, deliberate, permanently surprising man who listened to Pete Harmon's casual mentions and turned them into plans. Who showed love in square footage and building materials, and the correct interpretation of what she'd said she wanted 6 conversations ago. "Yes," she said. "That's what I want." He nodded once. "I'll draw it up," he said. He poured his coffee. She turned back to the stove. "William," she said. "Yeah. Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm doing it." She heard the sound he made, the low, involuntary half-laugh of a man who'd been outmaneuvered by his own argument. She smiled at the stove. It was Clem who first noticed what was happening in town, and Clem who told Eleanor about it directly, which was itself a measure of how much had changed between them. He found her by the East Paddock on a Wednesday and said without preamble, 3 families from up past the North Ridge lost everything in the fire. Structure damage, feed loss, most of their animals. They've been in town since November and there's—" He stopped. "There's not enough. The town's trying, but there's not enough, and winter's already here." Eleanor looked at him. "How many people?" she said. 3 families. 11 people total if you count the children. What do they need most urgently?" Clem went through the list. He'd clearly been paying attention, which told her he'd been thinking about this for more than a day. Eleanor was already making calculations. The pantry, the supply room. What Peterson had confirmed they had in surplus, what could be asked for without straining the ranch through the winter. "All right," she said. "Come inside." She sent a wagon to town the next morning with enough supplies to meaningfully change the situation for all 3 families. Food, blankets, tools. 2 sacks of seed grain from the surplus. Peterson had confirmed they could spare. She went herself with Clem driving, and she spent 3 hours in the town hall where the families had been sheltering, working out what they needed and what she could arrange, and what the spring would need to look like for them to have a chance at rebuilding. She met a woman named Ruth. Their mid-30s, 2 children, husband killed at the fire line trying to save a neighbor's barn, who looked at Eleanor when she walked in with an expression that was too tired for even hope. Eleanor sat down across from her. "Ruth," she said, "tell me what you had, and we'll work out what you need." Ruth stared at her. "You're Carter's wife," she said. "The one from back east." "Yes," Eleanor said. "They said you were—" Ruth stopped. "I know what they said," Eleanor said. "Are you going to let that stop you from talking to me?" Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly she started talking. She talked for an hour. Eleanor listened, took notes, asked questions, and by the end of it had the shape of a problem that was large but not impossible, which was the shape of most problems that felt like they were impossible until someone sat down and looked at them directly. When Eleanor walked back out to the wagon, Mrs. Aldridge was on the boardwalk. Eleanor had been expecting this. Mrs. Aldridge looked at the wagon, at the supplies, at Eleanor, and her expression did something complicated. "Mrs. Carter," she said. "Mrs. Aldridge," Eleanor said. "The families from the North Ridge." She stopped. That was kind." Eleanor looked at her. Mrs. Aldridge was not a woman who apologized. Eleanor could see that clearly enough. The thing she was being offered now was not an apology and was not going to become one. But it was a woman who had spent months wielding a certain kind of social power, looking at someone she'd underestimated and finding the reality of her both surprising and in some way she hadn't expected admirable. "Those are people in trouble," Eleanor said simply. "That's reason enough." Mrs. Aldridge was quiet. "The woman," she said finally. "Ruth. Her husband was Martin Reeves, was a good man. He worked hard." "I know," Eleanor said. "She told me about him." Something shifted in Mrs. Aldridge's face. If there's... She stopped. If there are other things needed for those families, through the winter, I have some capacity to contribute. Eleanor looked at her steadily. She thought about all the months of careful cruelty, the whispers and the boardwalk theater, and the suggestions delivered in the voice of concern. She thought about what Peterson had said, and what Clem had told her, and what Victoria Hale had tried to do, and all the weight of it, the cumulative pressure of a world that had decided Eleanor Whitmore was a target. And then she thought about Ruth's face when Eleanor had sat down across from her without flinching. She thought about what it meant to be the person who sat down. Yes, she said. I think there are things needed. Come to the ranch on Friday. We'll talk about what can be organized. Mrs. Aldridge blinked. She'd expected resistance. She'd have used resistance. The absence of it had taken her off balance. Friday, she said. 10 o'clock, Eleanor said. I'll have coffee ready. She climbed up to the wagon bench. Clem waited until they were 2 blocks from the main street. You just invited Mrs. Aldridge to the ranch, he said. Yes, Eleanor said. The same Mrs. Aldridge who has been telling half the county you've got some kind of dark hold over Carter. The very same, Eleanor said. Clem drove for a moment. Why? He said. Eleanor looked at the road ahead. Because she has influence in this town, she said. And the families on the North Ridge are going to need this town to be organized around helping them, not divided into factions over whether I belong here. She adjusted her coat. And because it's harder to keep hating someone you've sat across a table from and made a plan with. Clem was quiet. Also, Eleanor said, I want her to see the storage room. Peterson can show her what we've organized. That'll do more for my reputation than anything I could say in my own defense. Clem made a sound. Is that funny? She said. Little bit, ma'am, he said. Drive, Clem, she said. He drove. The Friday meeting happened, and Mrs. Aldridge came on a good horse and in good clothes, and sat at Eleanor's kitchen table, with the expression of a woman who was being careful, and Eleanor gave her coffee and talked to her for 2 hours about the North Ridge families, and what the winter needed to look like, and what the spring needed to build toward, and by the end of it, they had a plan that neither of them could have made alone. Mrs. Aldridge left without saying anything personal. She came back the following Friday. And the one after that. It wasn't friendship. Eleanor didn't pretend it was, and Mrs. Aldridge didn't pretend it was. But it was something 2 women with different kinds of power in the same small community, discovering that the thing they were both capable of was bigger than the thing they'd been using their energy to fight over. William watched all of this with the particular attention of a man who had learned to watch Eleanor the way he watched the land, not managing it, not trying to direct it, just paying close enough attention to understand what it was doing and why, and being genuinely surprised by it on a regular basis. One evening in the middle of December, with the snow deep and the kitchen warm, and the ranch settled into the particular deep quiet of a winter night, he said, Hargrove told me today that people in town have started calling this place the Carter place differently than they used to. She looked up from the accounts. Differently how, she said. He said they used to call it the Carter place, meaning the ranch. Now they call it the Carter place, like it's... He paused, looking for the word. Like it's a place that matters. Eleanor looked at him. He was watching her with that expression, the full-face one, the one she'd first seen the day the irrigation channel opened, the one she now knew was the real version of William Carter's face when he stopped managing it. It does matter, she said. Yeah, he said quietly. It does. He reached across the accounts ledger and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over. Outside, the snow came down in the dark, steady and enormous, and committed to the world it was making. And inside the kitchen, the lamp burned like it had been burning all along, and Eleanor Whitmore held William Carter's hand across the table, and knew with the specific, quiet, unshakable certainty of a woman who had earned every inch of it that she was exactly where she had decided to be. The new kitchen went up in April. It took 3 weeks, which was faster than William had estimated, and slower than Eleanor had hoped, and the compromise of those 2 timelines produced a building that was solid and practical and exactly right in the way that things made by people who know each other well tend to be exactly right. Peterson supervised the timber selection with an authority that nobody questioned. Clem put in 12-hour days without being asked. Pete whistled his 3 bars every morning from the roof while he worked the shingles, and Danny, whose wrist had healed clean and strong, which Eleanor took a quiet pride in, framed the doorway himself, and then stood back and looked at it with the expression of a young man who had made something real for the first time. Eleanor cooked for all of them every day of those 3 weeks, and every evening when the work stopped, the hands sat together in the main kitchen, and ate and talked and argued about small things, with the specific warmth of people who have been through enough together to know each other's actual shape, not just their working surface. She watched them and thought, I made this. Not alone, but I made this possible. The morning the new kitchen opened, Ruth came from town with her 2 children, and 3 other women came with her, women from the North Ridge families. Women from town who had been coming to the Friday meetings with Mrs. Aldridge, a young woman named Clara, not Carter's. Clara, a different Clara, who had ridden 15 miles alone because someone had told her there was a place in Red Creek Valley where a woman didn't have to pretend she was managing fine. She wasn't managing fine. Eleanor sat with her first before anyone else arrived in the new kitchen that still smelled of cut timber. And she listened, the way she had learned to listen completely without rushing toward solutions, without flinching at the parts that were painful to hear. When the young woman finished, her hands were shaking. I didn't know where else to go, she said. You went the right place, Eleanor said. That's all that matters now. She heard William's step on the boards outside. He'd come over from the main house to check something she knew, which was his version of wanting to make sure the morning had started well without making it about him. And she heard him stop outside the door when he heard voices, and then quietly move away. That was him now. That was the man he'd become. She thought about the man who had lifted her bags off the stagecoach platform and walked away without a word, and she thought about the man outside the door who had just given her the space she needed without being asked. And the distance between those 2 men was the distance of a whole winter and a real marriage, and the specific irreversible change that happens when 2 people decide to stop protecting themselves from each other. Mrs. Aldridge arrived at 10 o'clock exactly. She had, over the course of the winter meetings, developed a working relationship with Eleanor that neither of them would have described as warm, but that both of them would privately acknowledge had produced more good in 4 months than either had managed in the years before it. She came in with 2 covered baskets and set them on the new kitchen table, and looked around the room with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite categorize. It's a good building, Mrs. Aldridge said. Yes, Eleanor said. My husband said Carter built it faster than he's built anything in years. She paused. He said it's because he had someone to build it for. Eleanor said nothing. Mrs. Aldridge looked at her directly for a moment, one of the few times she had looked at Eleanor without the buffer of social performance between them. I was unkind to you, she said, when you arrived. You were, Eleanor said. I was protecting Clara's memory, she said. That's what I told myself. What were you actually doing? Eleanor asked. The question landed harder than it might have because it was the right question, and Mrs. Aldridge knew it. She looked at the baskets on the table. She was quiet for a long time. I was afraid, she said finally, that if someone like you could come here and belong could change things. Then everything I'd built here, all the rules I'd made about how things work and who matters and what a woman is supposed to be. She stopped. It would mean I'd been wrong about a great many things for a very long time. Eleanor looked at her. This woman who had made the first months in Montana harder than they needed to be. This woman who had whispered and implied and organized the social forces of a small town against someone she'd never bothered to know. This woman who had come back Friday after Friday to sit at a table and build something useful, because somewhere inside the performance of being Mrs. Aldridge of Red Creek was an actual person who was capable of recognizing what mattered. You weren't entirely wrong about everything, Eleanor said. Mrs. Aldridge looked up. You love this town, Eleanor said. You're good at organizing people. You know who needs what, and you have enough influence to actually move things. Those are real abilities. She held her gaze. You were just using them in the wrong direction. Mrs. Aldridge was quiet. Now you're using them in the right one, Eleanor said. That matters. The turning matters not just where you started. Something moved through Mrs. Aldridge's face that was too close to the surface to be managed properly. Clara Reeve, she said, using Ruth's maiden name by accident, then correcting it. Ruth. She told me what you said to her, that first day. She straightened slightly. She said you sat down without flinching. She needed someone to sit down, Eleanor said. Yes, Mrs. Aldrich said. She did. A pause. A lot of women in this valley need someone to sit down. I know, Eleanor said. That's why we built the kitchen. The moment stretched between them. Then Mrs. Aldrich unpacked her baskets with the efficient hands of a woman returning to what she knew how to do. And Eleanor turned back to the stove, and Ruth's children ran in from outside, with the noise and velocity of children who had been allowed to run somewhere safe, and the new kitchen filled up with the sounds of a morning that was doing what Eleanor had built it to do. The twist that Eleanor had not seen coming arrived in May, in a letter from Thomas. She read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, while William was out on the South Range, and she read it twice to make sure she'd understood it correctly. And then she sat very still for a moment, with the letter in her hands. Thomas had been corresponding with a lawyer in Boston. Not he wrote at anyone's request. He had done it himself quietly after their visit in November because there was something about Eleanor's situation that had troubled him in a way he couldn't fully explain, something about a woman who had come west with one suitcase and no safety net, who had no legal protection if the marriage failed, or William died, or any number of things that Thomas, as a practical man who had lost his own sister without warning, knew could happen without notice. The lawyer in Boston had located Eleanor's grandmother's estate documents. Eleanor's father's mother, a woman Eleanor had met twice as a child and remembered only as a large, quiet presence who smelled of lavender and said very little. At family dinners, had died in 1875. Her estate had been divided among her children, but there was a separate trust established separately that had been intended for Eleanor specifically. Eleanor's mother had never mentioned it. The trust had been sitting with the estate lawyers in Boston for 3 years, administered quietly, generating interest, waiting for Eleanor to claim it. It was not a fortune, but it was substantial. More than substantial. It was enough to build 4 kitchens. Enough to make the North Ridge families whole again. Enough to make Eleanor Whitmore, Eleanor Carter, a woman of independent financial means in a territory and a time when that was not a small thing. Eleanor sat with the letter for a long time. She thought about her mother's careful 3-page letter. About your father always said you were more capable than anyone gave you credit for. About the things that had been kept from her, not always from cruelty, sometimes from the specific cowardice of people who found it easier to manage a person than to trust them. She thought about the grandmother she barely remembered, the large, quiet woman at the dinner table. Had she known somehow? Had she looked at her granddaughter across a crowded room and seen what everyone else was choosing not to see? She was still sitting there when William came in. He read the letter when she handed it to him. He read it carefully, which was how he read everything, and when he looked up, his face was doing several things at once. You didn't know about this, he said. No, she said. Your mother didn't tell me. No. He was quiet. William, she said, because she knew him well enough now to know he was building toward something and needed the opening. What are you thinking? I'm thinking, he said slowly, that you came here with nothing because someone took something from you. And I want to be very careful right now about what I say next. She waited. The money is yours, he said. Entirely. Not the ranch's, not mine, yours. He put the letter on the table. Whatever you choose to do with it, that's your decision. I don't want to have any part of that decision. I want you to make it completely free of what I want. Eleanor looked at him. Why, she said, though she thought she knew. Because you came here because you'd been controlled, he said. Because you'd been managed and minimized and kept small by people who made decisions for you under the guise of knowing better. I'm not going to be another person who does that. His jaw was tight. The money is yours. Period. Eleanor felt something in her chest that was too large to name and too important to rush past. I know what I want to do with it, she said. He waited. The North Ridge families need land, she said. The land adjacent to Hargrove's east section is available. I saw it in the county listings last month. If those 3 families could establish there with their own water rights from the creek, She stopped. And I want to fund the kitchen properly, permanently, not depending on donations or goodwill. A real operating fund. She paused. And I want to set aside enough that if anything happens to you, she said, I don't have to be dependent on anyone's charity or anyone's pity. I want enough that I can make my own choices from strength, not from desperation. William was watching her. That last one, he said. Yes, she said. That's the most important one, he said. Yes, she said again. It is. He nodded once slowly. Write to Thomas, he said. Tell him to proceed with the claim. She picked up her pen. The money arrived in Red Creek in July, transferred through the county bank in Helena, and on the day Eleanor received confirmation, she went to find William in the barn and told him simply without ceremony, because ceremony was not how they operated. He looked at her. Good, he said. Yes, she said. He went back to what he was doing. She stood in the barn doorway for a moment, feeling the summer morning and the smell of horses and hay and honest work. And she thought about the woman who had stood in a small spare bedroom in October, with 2 bags and no plan, and a desperate private hope that somewhere in Montana there was a life that would fit her the way her actual life had never quite managed to fit. She had not imagined this. She had not had the nerve to imagine anything this complete. The land purchase for the North Ridge families closed in August, and Eleanor stood in the lawyer's office in Red Creek on the day of the signing with Ruth, beside her, and watched a woman who had spent 8 months in the specific particular misery of someone who has lost everything and doesn't know whether they're allowed to hope again, sign her name to a deed that put 40 acres under her family's feet. Ruth's hand was shaking. Eleanor put her hand over Ruth's on the table. Steady, she said. Ruth signed. She looked at Eleanor afterward with an expression that had too many things in it to speak too cleanly. I don't know how to, she started. You don't have to, Eleanor said. Just build something good on it. I will, Ruth said. And the way she said it was not a thank you. It was a vow. Eleanor walked out of the lawyer's office into the August heat of Red Creek's Main Street, and the town was doing what it always did, going about its business, horses at the posts, women on the boardwalk, the sound of the smithy from 2 streets over, and she stood in the middle of it and felt it differently than she had ever felt it before. Not as a place that had tried to push her out, as a place she had changed. Clem was waiting with the wagon. He looked at her face when she came out and said nothing, just nodded once in the way he'd learned from William, the specific short acknowledgement of a man who understands that a moment is too large for words and has the sense to honor that. She climbed up. They drove home. William was on the porch when they arrived, which told her he'd been watching the road. She got down from the wagon. She walked to the porch. I was looking at her with that expression, the full one, the real one, the one she had watched come back to him over the course of a whole winter and spring and summer, like a man relearning a language he'd almost forgotten. Done, he said. Done, she said. He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, which was something she did now without thinking about it, the way you lean into things that have proven they will hold you. They stood on the porch together and looked out at the Carter Ranch, at the range and the barn, and the new kitchen, and the fence line that she had partly built with her own blistered hands, and the irrigation channel they couldn't see from here, but knew was running, always running, the water moving through the system they had built together in the freezing cold, when it would have been so much easier to give up. I want to tell you something, William said. Go ahead, she said. I was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet before he said something true. When I wrote that advertisement, he said, I wrote it because I needed help with the ranch. That was the honest reason. I needed someone who could work. I wasn't looking for anything else. I didn't think I had anything else to offer. His arm tightened slightly around her. And then you stepped off that stagecoach, and you were already bracing for the impact before it came. You were already holding yourself for the hit. And I recognized it so completely that I couldn't look at you directly. Eleanor was very still. That's why I didn't smile, he said. Not because I didn't want to, because if I'd looked at you straight on in that moment, I would have seen myself, and I wasn't ready for that. She turned to look at him. I was looking at her with complete steadiness, the way he looked at things he had fully decided. "You didn't fix me," he said. "I want to be clear about that. You didn't rescue me. What you did was you just kept being yourself completely in front of me until I remembered I had a self too." He paused. "That's the harder thing. Anybody can rescue a person. It takes someone specific to remind them who they already were." Eleanor felt the thing in her throat that she no longer tried to swallow back. "William," she said. "I know," he said. "I just needed to say it." She put her hand against his chest. His heartbeat. Steady and real. Still the same as it had been the night she first felt it in the kitchen, and still the most grounding thing she had access to when the world tried to tell her something about herself that wasn't true. Pete's whistle carried across from the barn. 3 bars, just the 3, no more, as it would always be, and the horses moved in the paddock with their usual magnificent indifference to anything as small as human feeling. And the summer light lay across the Carter Ranch in the specific generous way of Montana, in August wide and golden and merciless in its beauty. "I need to start supper," Eleanor said. "I know," William said. Neither of them moved for another minute. Then she stepped off the porch and walked toward the new kitchen, and he watched her go, and somewhere in the barn, Pete was still whistling those 3 bars that his father had taught him, the ones without an ending. And Eleanor thought, as she pushed open the kitchen door into the warmth of the space she had imagined, and then built, and then filled with real people, doing real things that mattered, that sometimes that was exactly right. Some things didn't need an ending. Some things just needed to keep going. In the years that followed, people across the valley would tell the story of Eleanor Carter in different ways, depending on who was telling it and what they needed from it, which is how all true stories work. Some people told it as the story of the mail-order bride who surprised everyone. Some told it as the story of the kitchen, which by 1881 had helped more than 40 families in the Red Creek Valley through hardships that would have broken them without it. Some told it as the story of William Carter, who had been broken by grief and sealed himself against the world until a woman from Boston refused to let him stay that way. Ruth told it as the story of a woman who sat down. Pete told it to anyone who'd listen as the story of the irrigation channel, and what happened when you believe there's a third option when everyone else has given up on the first 2. Clem didn't tell it much. But when he did, he always started in the same place, a woman walking out of a stagecoach in October into a crowd of people who had already decided who she was, and the specific quality of the way she lifted her chin and walked toward the man who wasn't smiling, and how that was the moment he should have known how the whole thing was going to go. Mrs. Aldridge, in her later years, would occasionally mention Eleanor Carter to younger women in town, women who were struggling. Women who had been told they were too much or not enough, women who were bracing for the next impact before it arrived. She would mention her carefully in the particular style of a person who has learned something important from an unexpected source and is still working out the right way to acknowledge it. She never called it an apology, but the women she said it to understood what it was, and Eleanor herself. Eleanor, who had come 3,000 miles with 1 suitcase and a private, desperate hope, who had fixed fences and organized pantries and sat in barns with injured boys and held water diversions in smoke and signed land deeds with shaking women and built a kitchen that held the weight of a whole community's hardship. Eleanor in the evenings in the kitchen with the lamp burning and William's voice carrying from somewhere in the house and the sound of Montana all around her, enormous and cold and full of stars. Eleanor never spent much time telling the story at all. She was too busy living the life it had become, because the woman who had once been told she was too much and never enough had discovered the only truth that ever mattered, that the right life does not ask you to be smaller. It asks you to be exactly, completely, unapologetically yourself, and then it gives you somewhere worthy